Thanks for joining us here to watch the recording of our first in a series of virtual drink events we're hosting. My name is John, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southeast Asian Association of Graduate Employers. For those of you who tried to join the event online but couldn't, my sincere apologies. We were overwhelmed and reached our 100-person limit in the first 5 minutes, but hope this recording still gives you the opportunity to learn. We've cut the video into 3 separate clips corresponding to our agenda topics. Highlights from our COVID-19 impact survey we conducted in early April, virtual assessment centers where Alvin Lim from GSK and Michelle from Pymetrics will share their thoughts and tips on how to design one, and we'll end with representatives from Nanyang Technological University giving us some ideas on how the typical busy fall on-campus recruiting season may look differently in the post-COVID world. So let's join the event at the point where we start to share highlights from our survey report.
Let's just start with a little motivation of what we were trying to do here. As you know, this situation has impacted all of us in very significant ways. And what we want to do at SAGE was really to help our community by doing a quick, not a very exhaustive, but a quick pulse check of, how things were going with you, what kind of things were top of your mind, and hopefully reporting back a little bit to give us all some comfort that you will start to see that many of us are in the same boat, and perhaps potentially some insights and some food for thought as we're all trying to think about how we adjust and going forward. So I'm going to try to share some of the summaries of all the data points, not everything obviously here, but like I said, the issues that these data points point to are pretty meaty and require a lot of unpacking, which unfortunately we won't have the time to do today. And I'm not going to speculate too much on any hypothesis on why some of this data is showing up. I think there are lots of really interesting things to be discussed. So I'll ask you again to table some of that kind of thinking for the virtual drinks and to share. And I think we can even learn a little bit more at the large. And when it comes to the geographic breakdown, obviously, since we're based in Singapore, a lot of our respondents are based there. We have some good friends in Hong Kong that I know are on the call today, so we've got some traction there. And loosely the rest of the world, but really interesting some data points in the region, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, right? And even broader as we look at Asia Pac, Australia, India, South Africa, Vietnam, and of course, Europe and the US, okay? So the report is broken down by the recruitment lifecycle, taking you through each piece. And today, I'm going to share you a little bit from all the pieces except for the assessment piece. I think the assessment piece, when it comes to new stuff, that's partly the most mature, I would say. So there's probably not too many interesting things to share today. But again, there's some data that you can look on in the report. So with planning, the first question we asked you was about productivity. How have your teams been impacted when it comes to the COVID situation? And not surprisingly, 55% of you have told us that you have been negatively impacted, whether reduced or significantly reduced. So that's not too surprising. But I think interestingly and important to balance that out, that also means that 45% of you haven't been. And of the entire set, even 5% of our response said that their productivity has improved since this has been going on. As we drill down a little bit deeper on what we can tell about this group, with the industry lens here, of those who've been significantly reduced, a large chunk, 70%, come from the professional services industry. I have some hypotheses since I've spent my whole life in professional services, why that might be. And you can imagine the client-facing piece of professional services and the fact that we're not as, working collaboratively these days right next to you would be one of those reasons, but just something for you to kind of notice. And I guess when we cut it up across the geographies, there's actually not much difference here, right? You can kind of see the bars are fairly similar across Hong Kong versus Singapore and the rest of the world. Now, one of the big insights, and of course, there's a lot more data here that we crunched and sliced. One of the big insights we want to serve up today that obviously putting people first is really key when it comes to productivity, right? And one of the sub-questions we asked you was what elements have been impacted when it comes to productivity. And it turns out for the guys who really have been able to maintain the productivity or even improved it, the key for them has nothing to do with systems and processes. It's all about their team dynamics and all that kind of soft type of stuff, a healthy relationship, and of course, patience is one of those. Right? So if you're wondering what's going on or why it's been challenging, I'm sure this will resonate very well to you. And maybe a second takeaway to highlight today, obviously mindset is a big one, right? For those who told us, the 5% who told us that their productivity's improved, they ranked mindset the lowest in terms of element that was most impacted. And for those who told us they were most impacted negatively, right, a mindset was the highest in terms of elements. So you can see this is a very key one. And I also want to throw out there that for those of you who wrote in, some of you wrote in telling us that it's not only just the mindset of yourself and your team, but the mindset of your bosses, up the chain here, that whole, making sure everyone's aligned with this is obviously a big challenge, especially in the big global companies. So not super surprising, but the data proves what many of you were probably already experiencing, okay? So that's a little bit on the planning. Let's move on to the timelines, which is something you're also very interested in. How have timelines been impacted? Again, not surprisingly, the big majority, almost 50% of our respondents are in the wait and see mode, still wondering, what they should do. With only 16% of our respondents either continuing along with their original plans or some of them even taking the opportunity to accelerate, all right? Again, not to pick on professional services, but these guys have a lot of interesting things to say here. And when it comes to adaptability and maybe a little bit of agility, professional services makes up over 50% of those companies have decided to go back to the drawing board with their plans and restart this a little bit. And at the same time, they make up 3/4 of that 5% that we talked about that we're going faster here. So if you want to learn a little bit from what's going on here in your wait and see mode, perhaps some colleagues in professional services could give you some interesting sound bites. Something to do geographically, and this probably isn't too surprising for many of you that have an Asia-Pac remit. Here in Singapore, organizations are a little more conservative, right? 50% more companies are on hold versus companies in Hong Kong, right? As we look at that and compare the percentages. Right? And at the same time, almost 60% of the companies in Hong Kong are being a little more agile, either going back to the drawing board and actually doing something about it or continuing along the path. So again, I know we have this constant comparison and friendly rivalry between Hong Kong and Singapore, but the data clearly shows here that here in the Lion City, we are a little bit more conservative there, okay? And I guess it leads to this one big takeaway that I like, and a lot of the sub-data points pointed to this here. When it comes to your readiness, right, there are a lot of firms that, in the sub-questions you may remember, we asked you, how ready are you for this digital engagement? Well, even those who believe that they were more ready than others, both in terms of on-campus engagement, using technology for assessments, and even doing all the virtual digital interviewing, they are still quite conservative with their timelines. So being ready and being agile and ready to go are not, the same kind of thing, okay? All right, leave you with that. Next on the engagement, and just to tee up our third segment where we'll have NTU talk a little bit about their ideas and thoughts on how you can engage with them. Again, not too surprising here, a lot of the companies, the majority of respondents feel like they're pretty good, right? Anywhere from 3 to 5 out of a 5-point scale on being ready, right? As we drill down a little bit more, FSI, a little more conservative. I would say a little more cautious for a variety of reasons, right? Regulation and compliance, I know, is a big one in that industry that many of you talk to us a lot about. And on the flip side, technology, feeling a little bit more positioned, right? Tools that you're using, as we asked you, hey, what kind of tools are you planning to use? I guess not too surprising what the big ones were, but I think the takeaway I wanted to highlight here is that the newer edge technologies, things like the chatbots and the AI and the live streaming, actually being used much less, right? So I guess it's not one of those cases where there's a lot of buzz and perhaps hype in the media, different companies launching this, that, and what have you. But when it comes down to the actual execution, perhaps these things aren't ready for prime time yet. That's one potential hypothesis, okay? All right. And of course, we asked you a free-form question here and your thoughts on how can we maintain the personal touch then? Well, tons of quotes there, but I just want to highlight a couple for today. right? From one of our participants, they were talking about a lot of one-on-one phone interaction with targeted candidates to try to, introduce them and tell them a little bit more about us. Hey, the swag, I mean, that's a time-old tradition. I remember back even my old days, swag definitely works. And of course, the follow-up, right, which I liked. This one, I love it, very succinct here, show your face, which is key. I wasn't sure if this meant like turning on your cameras, because I know that's always a challenge video, but if that's what you meant literally, great, yes, I think that's important. But obviously, that human part. And this one, right, as a converted design thinker, a big one I'm at, this is obviously a big one, thinking human first. So I guess the red takeaway there is there's a lot of talk of more personal communication, which isn't always the norm for candidates in what some of us would call the mass market channel of campus recruitment versus the high-end executive search type channel here. But it's nice to see. Of course, the insight that we want to flag to you is that, okay, you want to do high touch, but how do you think you may be able to do this? Assuming that there's going to be a virtual component, right? Potentially blended, hopefully, where most likely you're going to have probably the same and maybe even less resources. Just something to kind of flag for you. And powering through for the interviewing section, which will kind of set us up for our two speakers that will follow. How much are you doing virtually? Well, we asked you a couple of data points. What were you doing prior to January? And you can see about 33% on average of your interviewing was being done virtually. But since January, that's picked up quite a bit. 3/4 of your interviews are being done now through the digital platform, with a pretty big 42% having moved almost all the way to 100%. Now, for some of you, that move was small. You didn't probably have to go too far. But for some companies, that was literally going from 0 to 100, right? In the span of probably weeks. Yeah. So just to kind of show you that many of you are in similar boats here. Let's drill down, though, on the hot one, this thing called assessment centers that we'll dig a little bit in a few minutes from now here. We asked you, hey, when it comes to ACs, for those of you who do ACs, what are you planning to do? You plan to keep them? Do you plan to modify them? Or actually, you don't do them at all? And it turns out, as we break it down by industry groups, healthcare turned out to be a little more conservative, with 50% of the companies, the largest chunk of the industry, saying, you know what, we're gonna stop this AC thing while we kind of regroup ourselves. Of course, that's why we invited our guest speaker today. He is from the healthcare industry because he's bucking the trend and going with this thing, and we'll hear from him shortly, right? On the other extreme, though, our colleagues in financial services, right? More than 50% of our respondents emphasize say, hey, we're going full steam ahead, right? Obviously with some changes, but we plan to keep our ACs going. Yeah. And maybe the last call out here, right, of those who don't use ACs, it was interesting to notice that technology firms identified as the highest, about 77% of them saying, hey, actually we don't do other ACs. But some of us have noticed that assessment centers in a technology space may mean different things than the traditional thing that some of us are used to, like the role plays and the case studies. Things like hackathons that some of you may do is kind of like a form of assessment centers, right? But it was neat to kind of call that out a little bit. Okay. All right. And just to kind of set up our next event that we want to do a little tease, this other very hot thing, internships, right? Especially those virtual internships. We asked you here, how are you handling the upcoming summer internship program? And as you can kind of see, people are scrambling. 65% are thinking that we got to make some changes. 25% plan to stay the course, and 10% are like, you know what, we're not ready for this kind of stuff. And as you dig a little bit deeper, the FSIs are adjusting the quickest, with 90% of all companies saying we got to make some changes, right? And of those making some changes, they're usually the ones that have large intakes, right? Over 100 either interns plus full-time hires as part of their graduate program. Right. Those on the other end, though, right, are usually the small guys. 70% of the companies with either small programs, and we define that as 40 or less, and 50% of all our startup-y guys, less than 100 people in the organization, and 20% of all MNCs are not making changes. They continue to stay the course. And last but not least, for those canceling, my peers in professional services, they lead the pack here, and actually a lot of the big companies as well. Okay. All right. Where's the pressure coming from? Not too surprisingly, a lot of it to do with the regulations, right? Whether it's the government immigration rules, or here in Singapore, we'll call it the circuit breaker rules of what you can and cannot do. And some of the restrictions that universities have leading the pack here. And I know we'll address this a little bit in our third segment with NTU. And I guess I'll end finally with a little bit about the future, right? What have you told us about your thoughts for the future? Well, look, everyone's saying this phrase that we started with, do you believe this is the beginning of a new revolution? Well, overwhelmingly, you're saying yes. And of all those who say, yeah, this is it, you happen to be big from the multinationals. Again, a little detail of those who disagree tend to be the startup-y guys. Not too surprising there. They like to kind of buck the trend sometimes and think a little unconventionally, right? And they generally have smaller numbers, so that may change a little bit of their perspective and context. But ever the idealists, the tech companies agree the most with this statement. And our FSI colleagues, we're calling them the true believers. They are the ones that constitute the biggest group of the strongly agreed, right? When we looked at those, more than half of those were FSI companies saying, yeah, for sure. This is definitely going to be the new big thing. Okay. So a couple of comments here. I think you can kind of see their pros and cons. Without reading the whole thing, I think on the pros side, many of you are saying this is a great opportunity for trialing things, finally, right? I know we've been talking about a lot of these tools and procedures, but this is going to be the way to try them up, and people are going to start to see that there's some real benefit, especially on the bottom line. But on the flip side, many of you did say a similar comment to here where, this is easy for recruiters to embrace, right? But the business leaders, this is a little bit trickier for them. And this respondent was saying that a lot of us might be doing a lot of knee-jerk reactions to try to adjust and react. But they believe that once things go back, when they go back, right, that we may just all go back anyways. And they're a little concerned, a little bit skeptical about that, right? So I love this one, not just a revolution, but a paradigm shift from one of our participants. But let's lead you with some numbers to close off this segment here. When it comes to the actual numbers, when we asked you, hey, where do you think the targets are going to be for next year, both internships and for full-time? Look, it's pretty rosy here. Many of you are very optimistic, right? With over 75% saying it's either going to be the same in terms of numbers of, graduates we need or even more, and only 25% of you with a pessimistic view. And there was no correlation for those of you that said that it might be less with any specific industry, geographic location, or size of the company. Okay. All right. So look, we are very conscious that when we asked you this was a different time. Right, this survey, and we tried to crank this out as quickly as possible, but most of our respondents came in early April, and things have changed in many of the parts of the world differently. So I'm guessing if we polled you again, you might have something different to say. Remember, the point of this was really just to spark some conversation, give you a little bit of comfort and some food for thought, and continue, with a lot of these conversations in future discussions. Okay.
Thanks so much for watching. To download a copy of the full report, please see the link in the video description. In part 2 of this 3-part series, we'll be discussing virtual assessment centers. Finally, make sure you check out our next event where the topic will be virtual internships. Microsoft will be taking us behind the scenes along with their partners, DBL and Inside Sherpa, sharing with us some of the key considerations and trade-offs they had to make, major challenges they had to overcome, and lessons learned.